I have always been really curious about how the natural world functions. A big part of our contemporary world is the human impact on the environment, and urbanization is the most obvious aspect of that.
Urbanization is the growth of cities and their populations. As cities grow, they radically transform the habitats where many species live.
Urban areas tend to be hotter, they tend to be dominated by concrete and asphalt and fewer trees.
Scientists like Kristin Winchell want to find out if and how species are surviving in these urban habitats. And one little lizard is providing some surprising answers.
Anoles are this fantastically diverse group of small lizards.
Anoles are adorable.
Shane Campbell-Staten met Kristin during graduate school, when they were both studying anoles.
I presented my findings, and Shane came up to me afterwards and said, we should do something together with these lizards in the city.
For me, I just want to do dope science with dope people.
One of those people is their collaborator, Alberto R. Puente Rolón, in Puerto Rico.
Anoles are this amazing group of lizards that you can see almost everywhere here in Puerto Rico. Anoles are always connected to us, even backyard, inside the house, outside the house, or even in the forest.
Puerto Rico is an excellent place for studying anoles in urban areas because it's one of the oldest urbanized regions in the Caribbean. There are abundant lizards in both the forest and the urban areas.
But we've come to study one particular species, which is the Puerto Rican crested anole.
Kristin was looking for places to study anoles, so we started a collaboration to identify sites all over Puerto Rico. I was looking into these urban areas, identify potential study sites, catching anoles.
My research would not really be possible without Alberto. He's just a wealth of knowledge about all of the natural history of Puerto Rico.
The scientists wanted to know if and how anoles are changing in cities. Their first question was simple. Which traits, if any, differed between the forest and urban anoles?
We know from the forest environments that lizards that are perching on really broad tree trunks tend to have much longer limbs relative to their body size, whereas those lizards that are perching on really thin perches, they tend to have really short limbs.
These traits help anoles move quickly and safely on the kinds of surfaces they're most likely to encounter. Would the limbs of urban lizards be longer or shorter?
We also looked at toe pads.
Anoles have toe pads on their feet, with specialized scales that help them cling to smooth, slippery surfaces like leaves.
In forested environments, lizards high up in the trees tend to have really large toe pads to cling to those leaves and prevent falls.
Common surfaces in urban environments, like metal and painted concrete, also tend to be slippery. How big or scaly might the toe pads of urban lizards be?
Cities are also very different thermal environments. Because there are so many artificial surfaces, it makes cities very warm.
Since buildings, sidewalks, and streets tend to hold heat, cities are often several degrees warmer than forests. Would lizards in cities be better at handling the heat? To answer these questions, the team collected lizards from both urban and forest environments around Puerto Rico.
To do any studies in anoles, you need to get authorization to handle and to manage the species. So it's very important the collaboration between the scientists doing the work in Puerto Rico, the local scientists also in Puerto Rico, and the community around the forest in Puerto Rico.
We took those lizards and brought them back to our field laboratory, and that's where we quantified their phenotypes, their traits. So we take digital x-rays because that allows us to measure really precisely the bone lengths. Then we also take high-resolution images of the toe pads.
Kristen also wanted to know whether the lizard's limb lengths and toe pads affected how quickly they could move across forest and urban surfaces. To test this directly, she and her team got creative.
We built lizard race tracks.
They made 3 tracks with different surfaces: tree bark, sheet metal, and painted concrete.
We took lizards from both forest and urban environments, and we set them racing on these racetracks.
Meanwhile, Shane tested the heat tolerance of anoles from both urban and forest environments.
We very slowly heat them up and we flip them onto their backs because an anole pretty much always wants to be on its feet.
When an anole gets too hot, it loses coordination and can't turn itself over anymore. Shane recorded the temperature at which this happened as a measure of each lizard's heat tolerance. Through their experiments, the scientists found that urban anoles did have traits that differed from forest anoles.
The urban lizards had relatively longer limbs for their body length, relatively larger toe pads with more of those specialized scales. When they had both of those traits together, those toe pads that are large and the long limbs, they were able to sprint the fastest on the challenging surfaces like painted concrete walls.
Next, they looked at the data on heat tolerance.
So we found that in cities, lizards were much more heat tolerant than their counterparts in neighboring forests.
The team's next question was, what caused the differences between the city and the forest anoles?
It may be due to genetically based differences between individuals where a population moves into a city, and then there's some individuals that are just genetically able to be more heat tolerant right off the bat. And those individuals are cruising while everybody else is panting, and they're able to survive, function, reproduce, and pass those genes on to the next generation. Right? That's natural selection and evolution. It could also be that for an individual lizard, it moves from a forest into a city, and that city is a hotter environment. And by being exposed to that hotter environment, that individual becomes more tolerant to that environment. And that's what we call plasticity.
One way to determine which process is shaping a trait is through a common garden experiment.
And in this type of experiment, you take organisms from different environments and you put them in the same conditions and rear their offspring. The idea is that if these trait differences are genetically determined, that when you raise those offspring in the same environment, they'll still have the same phenotypes that their parents did in those different environments that they evolved in. If instead the traits are very heavily environmentally determined, then you would see the trait differences go away. And the forest lizards and the urban lizards would have the same phenotype when raised in these common conditions.
The scientists found that even when raised in the same environment, the offspring of urban lizards still had longer limbs and larger toe pads than the offspring of forest lizards.
And so we can understand from that that the urban populations have genetically based adaptations to the environment.
But when they looked at heat tolerance, they got a very different result.
Urban and forest lizards end up having the same thermal tolerance after a certain period, and their offspring have the same thermal tolerance. And so this trait is really highly plastic.
So, both evolution by natural selection and plasticity help explain the differences between forest and urban anoles.
When we think about our impact on the planet, a big question is whether or not the species that live alongside us, are they going to be able to continue to do what they do.
Understanding why some animals and plants are able to adapt to urban environments is really important for a conservation perspective.
Understanding how animals adapt to the city can tell us how different species can adapt to future conditions, even us. So we start with the small ones to try to predict what's going to happen in the future.